We are going to talk about UP Urban Buildings Regulation of Letting, Rent and Eviction Act 1972. So in this we are going to talk about objects of this act, then the salient features, the extent and applicability of this act, and as well as few exemptions to this act. So if we talk about the object of this act, basically the object of this act was towards the regulation of rent and eviction of tenants in case of certain classes of buildings situated in urban areas of Uttar Pradesh or UP. Now if we talk about the salient features, if we compare this act with the old act, then under the old act the district magistrates were given some unfettered discretionary powers, and which they used against the eviction of tenants. So as a result, the district magistrates sometimes they used their discretionary powers for the eviction of tenants in such a vague manner that some of their decisions were faulty and erroneous. However, with the coming of this act, the eviction of tenants, the grounds for eviction and release of tenants has been restricted. So similarly, the jurisdiction of ejectment or for the eviction of tenants under this act would be in court of small cases, small causes courts. Similarly, under the new act, if the tenant wants to do some repair in the house, then they can do it with 2 months of rent. In lieu of 2 months of rent, they can do the house repairs. However, in the earlier act, they could use only 1 month's rent. Similarly, under this new act, if the tenant dies, then the legal heirs of the tenant would be entitled for the same benefits as the tenant was entitled for. Next, this act would be applicable to such buildings which has been constructed or which have been constructed for more than 10 years. Similarly, the liability of the tenant to pay the advance taxes has been reduced from 1/3 to 1/4. Now, if we talk about the extent of this act, so this act is it extends to all the districts of Uttar Pradesh or UP. If we talk about the applicability of this act, then this act is applicable to all the cities which have been defined under the UP Nagar Mahapalika Adhiniyam 1959. Similarly, it is also applicable to each and every municipality that has been defined in United Province Municipalities Act 1916. Similarly, it also applies to every notified area constituted under the United Province Municipalities Act 1916. Similarly, it also applies to each and every town constituted under the United Province Town Act 1914. So now if we talk about the exemptions, then there are certain buildings which have been exempted from this act, and the act would not apply in case if there is any building that has been taken by government or any local authority or any public sector or any cantonment as their landlord. Similarly, if the building has been vested as a public charitable trust or any educational trust or any waqf building, then too this act would not apply. Similarly, this act would not apply to any building that has been used as a factory or has been used for the industrial purpose, for cinemas or theaters. However, in case if the building, in any cinema, if there are any shops that are located, then such shops would come under this Rent Control Act. So similarly, if any building has been used for public entertainment, then too this would be exempted from the Rent Control Act. Similarly, if the rent of the building exceeds rupees 2000, then too it would be exempted. So if similarly, if any building that has been used or has been built or has been held by under the Societies Registration Act 1860, then too it would be exempted. Now one more thing is that if any building if has been constructed after 26th April 1985, then for the next 40 years, that is till 2025, this building the building would not come under the preview of Rent Control Act. तो अगर कोई भी बिल्डिंग जो कि 26 अप्रैल 1985 के बाद कंस्ट्रक्ट हुई है, then it would not come under the Rent Control Act. So the basic purpose of however, one more important point, and this is that in now how to prove that the building has been built after 26th April 1985. So in case if there is no other proof available, then the date of first assessment done by your municipality would be taken as a date of construction. So the basic purpose of that I have been discussing for the last few minutes, the provisions and whether the building is covered under the Rent Control Act or not, is that if a building is covered under the Rent Control Act, then it gives more protection to the tenant. However, if the building is exempted or is not covered under the Rent Control Act, then it gives more protection to the landlord. So in case the other important point is that in case if the value of the suit is less than 25,000, then the jurisdiction will be the lower court. However, in case if the monetary value of the suit is more than 25,000, then the jurisdiction would be of district judge. So in both the cases, whether the building is covered under the Rent Control Act or not, or whether the building is covered under the UP Urban Buildings Regulation of Letting Rent and Eviction Act or not, the process for ejectment of the tenant would be the same. That is, you have to give the notice under section 106 of Transfer of Property Act 1882. However, in case if the building is covered under the Rent Control Act, then you would proceed under section 21 of the said act, that is the UP Urban Buildings Regulation of Letting and Rent and Eviction Act 1972 under section 21. In case if it is not under the Rent Control Act, then you may proceed directly. So this is all about UP Urban Buildings Regulation of Letting, Rent and Eviction Act 1972. Thank you.